If you have topics you would like to have us discuss on the Aging Well podcast, please click on the links in the episode description to send us a text or record your message or comments. We'd love to hear from you and how we can help you age well. If you benefit from the Aging Well podcast and would like to support the content financially, please click on the Support the Show link or support our affiliates and advertisers. Welcome to the Aging Well podcast. I'm Jeff Armstrong here with Corbin Bruton. In this and the episodes that follow, we will share candid discussions on aging and hear from the experts. We are here to inform and encourage as we experience, aging. In this episode, we respond to an article in Box Life magazine titled 16 Common Exercises That Suck, According to Physical Therapists and Their Better Alternatives. All right, Corbin, I came across an article I think we're going to love to talk about because you know how we love ripping apart some of these different articles that are out there in popular press. And this one is titled 16 Common Exercises That Suck, According to Physical Therapists and Their Better Alternatives. And I think, there's some good and some bad in here. It kind of starts off saying, not all exercises are created equal, but many workouts promise to sculpt, tone, and transform your body. Some popular moves might be setting you back rather than propelling you forward. And so let's talk about these so-called worst 16 exercises.
Yeah, definitely. We have not done one of these in a really long time, actually. And you know what? They're fun to do. They're fun to break down. But more importantly, it's cool to kind of show the readers or the listeners a different perspective when they come across these articles. Because sometimes when they come across these articles, there's a lot of clickbait and there's a lot of wow words like, oh, okay. And they're hooked. But it's not necessarily the best bit of advice. And luckily on the Aging Well podcast, we actually have someone who has their doctorate in exercise science and physiology. So we can, we actually have some credentials to break these down.
And these articles, they're clickbait for me because I read them and occasionally I get ones that are pretty good and some are good and bad. This one I think has some good, some bad in it, but I figure let's jump into it. And the first exercise is the pec deck fly. Why it sucks? The pec deck fly is a staple of many chest day routines, but it's not without its faults. Primarily, this machine can place a significant amount of stress on the shoulder joints. What are your thoughts on the pec deck?
I feel like it can if you're doing it incorrectly or if you're not seated. But the best part about a pec deck is you can adjust the seating, and a lot of them you can actually come out. I do see what they're saying. Personally, when I've used the pec deck, I use it correctly. I don't actually feel any pain in my shoulder. And I feel an amazing pump right in my center chest, like right where my pectoralis major meets my sternum. And I don't get that from regular flies, but I do get it right in a pec deck.
And this article is a little bit more directed towards bodybuilding. And so in bodybuilding, you're going to tend to use more machines. I personally try and avoid using machines. I mean, for me, it's a necessity because I don't have machines at home. I have a power rack downstairs in my garage. But when we use machines, we do tend to have a very limited movement pattern. Whereas if you do like a dumbbell fly, which I also don't normally recommend, because when we do flies, whether on a pec deck or with a dumbbell, we do tend to really overly stretch the joint. And if we're weighting heavily, we put a lot of stress on the corticobrachialis, which is a small muscle at the anterior part of the shoulder. And that can cause a lot of stress to that muscle, a lot of stress to the shoulder joint. And so you're probably better off doing some varieties of presses that will help to get you through that range of motion. You're going to work the triceps as well as the pecs. And if you concentrate really on getting that added squeeze at the top, there's some really good exercise, even just taking a plate and squeezing the plate in the top position can help get that extra little pump that you're talking about in the middle chest. But for most of us, and most of those listening to this are trying to just simply age well. They're not looking to become bodybuilders, or they might be bodybuilders, but um, I think just other alternatives using dumbbells if you have to do a chest fly, or using other exercises. I like the landmine press for getting that kind of middle chest development a little bit more effectively. But overall, I mean, I don't disagree with their arguments against the pec deck. I do think if you're bodybuilding, you're probably going to need to do the pec deck to a certain extent to get that development that most bodybuilders are looking for. Um, Dumbbell presses are going to be great. They're going to be better for strength and better all for overall shoulder joint uh, health. Challenge, I think, with doing even dumbbell bench presses is as you get stronger, those heavier and heavier dumbbells, getting those up into position are is going to be much more difficult and can increase the risk of injury. And then when you fatigue, getting the dumbbells back down to the floor can be a source for injury. So I would recommend anybody who wants to do heavy dumbbell work to invest in a set of the Mad Spotters. And you can just kind of go online and find those. It's not endorsing a product per se, or we're not getting any payment for this, but I do think it's a pretty good tool because you're able to rack the dumbbells on a barbell behind you so that you're in a better position to start the exercise.
Okay, so in conclusion, a best alternative would either be that dumbbell bench press, or you said a landmine?
Yeah, landmine.
Or like a hex press?
Not a hex press, but a landmine. Landmine. Any kind of landmine variation of a press can be much more beneficial. I think the point here is as much variety as possible is going to be better. But again, when I say variety, I don't mean switching up the exercise every workout. Do something consistently for a 3 to 4 week period before changing the exercise, and that's going to give you a greater amount of strength development and I think overall motor neural training to the muscle.
Would you also say like a cable X over where you have the cables out? Because I feel like that will not necessarily put the tension on the shoulders based on how you're standing, and you're still coming across the body. So you're still getting that internal pectoralis major and minor. You'd actually be working it that way.
I think that's another alternative as well. But again, you may not have access to that. I find in gyms when they do have the crossover pulleys like that, it's a tough machine because multiple people want to use it, and it's going to interfere with other people training, or other people might be using it in other ways that's going to interfere with your training. So I think dumbbell is kind of a better way to go. What's number 2?
Number 2 is concentration curls. And it says, why it sucks. The concentration curl has been the go-to exercise for those looking to isolate their biceps. While it might seem effective for targeting the peak of the bicep muscle, it's seated, isolated, natural, limits the engagement of other muscle groups and body overall function and strength. And I agree with this one.
Yeah, I don't disagree either. Again, I think any isolation exercises can tend toward a waste of time unless you are a bodybuilder needing to more precisely develop the muscle and you're not after strength. I personally don't even do a heck of a lot of bicep curl work or really isolated arm work because I don't have the time. B, I'm not after that bodybuilder type development. I'm just more after strength. And so concentration curl would be one of the last go-to exercises I would do for the biceps. I probably prefer more of a hammer curl because you're getting really that full range of motion because you're having to come from a pronated, more or less, more neutral position into supination as you're curling up. And so you're getting a much greater stretch, much greater range of motion on the bicep muscle. They say incorporate standing barbell curls. That's good as well. I mean, there's tons of different alternatives that you can do the bench press or the bicep curl that are going to be more effective than the concentration curl.
Well, and then it just how you mentioned with the hammer curl going from a pronated, and as you curl it up into that supinated position, you're working both the bicep brachii and the brachialis simultaneously. So you're working them together. Um, One thing that they don't mention on here, and I would have never thought about this until we started doing this podcast and I started diving more and more and more into exercises and workout and literature, but either a close grip pull down because it works the top head of the bicep, same with pull-ups or chin-ups. And there's a lot of literature out there that really blows up that bicep and makes it look even more bigger and aesthetically appealing.
Yeah, I think again, it's a lot of it is variety. What are your goals? What equipment do you have available to you? And just do the exercise, do it effectively, and try and optimize your time as much as possible. Remember, opportunity costs. I discussed my epigenetics test with True Diagnostic co-founder Hannah Wendt in episode 162. Epigenetic testing measures baseline and changes in your pace of aging, giving you the power to steer your anti-aging or health and wellness journey in the right direction. I learned that I am aging well. Click on the affiliate link in the episode description, use the promo code AGEWELL, and receive a 12% discount on your epigenetics test and monitor your pace of aging.
Number 3, tricep kickbacks. They dive into why it sucks. Tricep kickbacks are often touted for the ability to target the tricep muscles. However, the position and movement restricts the amount of weight that you can use without compromising form, which can limit the effectiveness. Additionally, the bent over position can put unnecessary strain on the lower back, especially with the improper form or heavier weights.
That last part I don't necessarily agree with. It can put unnecessary strain, but bent over rows, RDLs, all those things are basically putting you in the same position. The idea is you need to have a correct hip hinge if you're going to do the tricep extensions or tricep kickbacks safely. And so it does put a lot of effort into the glutes and the hamstrings in order to maintain that position, which you're exhausting a large group of muscles isometrically and possibly even unnecessarily because they're not under a lot of load just to hit the triceps. And you actually hit probably more the lateral heads of the tricep, which is a more smaller part. I think there are far better ways that we can work the triceps. They say to do instead skull crushers or lying triceps. I think those are very different exercises because of the positioning. When your arms are flexed at 90 degrees, you're now kind of working different heads of the triceps, whereas in the tricep kickback, the arm is a bit more extended. So I would think a better alternative to that particular exercise would be just a cable push down or pull down, where you're using either a rope or a bar to, just standing upright, extending the arms with the arms at the sides.
I would say a better alternative would be a standing overhead tricep extension.
Okay, different exercise though.
Yeah, but look, as you have it up above your head and you fully extend and you're coming down, you're stretching that tricep.
Yeah, but you're stretching a long head. So it's a different exercise. And so you start looking at, apples and oranges or, different strains of apples in this case, so it's, Fuji, Granny Smith, or Red Delicious. They're different. They're all delicious, but they're different, right? And so you have to look at what am I trying to do with the tricep here? And if I'm talking the tricep kickback, we're talking about working more the lateral head with the arm in a more extended position, then the better exercises are going to be like a cable push down or movement like that. Or I would even argue a dip.
I would agree with you on
so
dips.
there are plenty of better exercises that are going to hit those lateral heads. I do agree with you. They think the overhead or a skull crusher type of tricep exercise is a much more overall effective exercise for the entire three heads of the tricep. So yeah, they're not too bad in there, and I would probably agree with that. I don't think there's a huge risk of injury with the tricep kickback if done correctly. I just feel like it's a very ineffective exercise because with the positioning, you're going to tend to use a lighter load in order to do that. Much more of the effort is going into the shoulders as opposed to the triceps because the shoulders are having to hold the arm in that position in order for you to extend. And then as you kind of get up to, if you really kind of look at the movement, you're not really working against gravity until you're at least at about 30 to 45 degrees of extension there. And it's like, I think there's better exercises. So far, we're not really poo-pooing this article too much, though.
Well, I mean, we're providing more
insight, perhaps.
more benefit on alternatives.
Yeah. So their next one is the rolling shrug, which rolling shrugs are kind of stupid no matter what. I mean, rolling shrugs are performed in an attempt to work the tricep muscles from multiple angles, which just an ad, if anybody's doing it for that purpose, they have a complete misunderstanding of kinesiology and how the muscles work. They say what to do instead. The standard shrug, focusing on proper form, control, movement. I'm less and less a fan of shrugs in general, just because they primarily work the upper trapezius. I have found that a much more effective exercise for trapezius development is our face pulls. Using cable face pulls and doing them, keeping the arms up high, getting some good external rotation in there. So you're working the rotator cuff, you're working the upper and middle trap, you're working the rhomboids, you're working the shoulders a bit more. And I get much, much better development doing that than I've ever gotten doing shrugs. And shrugs, you can go really, really heavy and not get much benefit out of it. So you end up having to increase the load to a much, much greater extent to get more and more development out of your traps. And you're working, do your deadlifts, your RDLs, and other pulling motions, you're probably getting as much trap work anyhow as you would with shrugs. So I would think, if I talk about opportunity costs and trying to limit the things in the gym that are getting you the least amount of benefit for the amount of time that you're putting into it, I'd say shrugs, whether rolling shrugs or, a standard shrug, is going to be one of those things that I would really eliminate.
Yeah, I have no feedback on this one. I think shrugs are stupid. That's just my opinion. And I really don't have any, I don't really have an alteration.
Smoking is a guy with small traps. No.
Yeah, I mean, I do, but I also have never wanted to have big traps. I just don't think it's aesthetically,
we could, agree to disagree on that one.
Big traps?
I think traps are a very important muscle. I mean, and I think, the neck, the traps, the rhomboids, as we kind of, when we talked about that, I think a little bit in one of the episodes, we talked about core. The core to me runs from the neck all the way down to the ankles, and having strong traps is what's going to help us to have better posture, which as we age is going to help us to limit some of the risk of falls. We can carry things more effectively. We can avoid some of that kyphotic posture that we start to see in older adults. So I would argue that having strong traps is an important muscle group for aging well.
I'm not saying having strong isn't important, especially, with our Superior 7 when we add the farmer carries.
Superior 7.
Yep. We add the farmer carries in, right? And that's good posture, fully standing up in an erected form and walking in a perfectly straight line. You have to have that balance, that stability, and that core, that overall core strength from neck to pelvic all the way around. And
that's a good point too. I think, the farmer carries would probably even be a better exercise for the traps than doing shrugs.
But to just go up and down with your shoulders,
you're not getting that much out of it. But
what are you practicing? What are you, I'm confused. I don't know. I don't know.
So, yeah. I do think it's important to have strong traps, and I like the aesthetics of a strong neck and strong traps. It shows health and strength. And so we can have a whole other discussion on those kind of aesthetics. I mean, I would have big neck and strong traps before I would have a 6-pack ab. But let's move on to the next one. Leg extension. Then they quote a physical therapist here, Joe Tata. I hope I pronounced that correctly. If not, I apologize, Joe. Using a leg extension machine isn't functional. There is no natural movement in life where you sit and straighten your knee with a 100-pound load against it. Okay, yeah, I agree with that. I don't think it is functional. I do think from a bodybuilding standpoint, doing leg extensions is going to be a necessity to get that aesthetic look in the muscle. But again, if you're bodybuilding, you're spending hours at the gym and you want to do a lot of exercises in order to optimize development. For those of us that don't have a lot of time, or those of us who are just simply trying to age well and age strong, leg extensions are one of those opportunity cost exercises. They take up too much time to target one muscle group, and we can get as much benefit doing other basic squat movements. And so I would favor a squat, particularly the Zercher squat, over doing a leg extension exercise. What are your thoughts?
Well, I will agree that a leg extension is primarily used for bodybuilding and aesthetics. There also is a lot of literature out there that it can be used with lighter loads, obviously, for rehab around the knee and just kind of strengthening the muscles around. So if someone had like knee surgery, a lot of times when they go see their physical therapist or their occupational therapist, they do leg extensions to strengthen the muscles around. But yet overall function, I would definitely be saying squats.
And I would even argue from a physical therapy standpoint, and I'm not a physical therapist, but I've helped train a few.
Right.
I would prefer doing some other squat variation in order to begin to strengthen those quads, because you can do a assisted squat exercise that is going to enable you to use the quads, but you're also using other muscles. There's also a bit more multi-directional. There's multi-axes that are being incorporated into that movement, even though the knee is essentially a modified hinge, which means it flexes and extends with some level of internal and external rotation, which is another key point, I think, with doing more of a squatting exercise as opposed to a leg extension, is that the knee isn't a true just hinge joint. And so you miss a little bit of that rotational strength, and getting the popliteus in there as we lock and unlock the knee can be a little bit more beneficial, I think, doing single leg or even squatting movements assisted or, progressively loading those.
Yeah, I've been pronouncing that wrong for years. I thought it was the popliteus. I didn't know it was popliteus.
Yeah, it says popliteus. There are some words in anatomy that can be pronounced multiple ways, but that is not one of them.
Oh. I mean, I spelt it right on my anatomy exam. That's all that matters.
Well, you didn't have me for any anatomy, so. So leg curl is the next one. And of course, leg curl falls under some of the same criticisms as the leg extension, because it's basically just the opposite movement. It isolates the hamstrings in just a singular joint kind of movement. I do think from a bodybuilding standpoint, you can't not do the leg curl, although you could do more of a Nordic curl. But I have concerns about Nordic curls because I feel like because you may be lifting much heavier weight than your muscles are able to do, that there's a greater risk of a strain, if you pull on that too quickly. And so I don't mind the leg curl. Certainly it is not a great exercise for pregnant women because you're put in a position where it's just um, you know, more harmful to the baby and to your lower back, but there are alternatives to doing that. What they recommend instead is, and typically what I do for hamstrings is the Romanian deadlift. Um, and you got other variations of that. There's the stiff-legged deadlift, good mornings, and some of those where you're going to be utilizing the hamstrings in that regard. I find that to be a very effective alternative to the leg curl. What do you think?
Yeah, I would say RDLs would definitely be good because with just the leg curls, I mean, you're primarily focusing on the bicep femoris. But if you do RDLs, you're hitting all three of the hamstrings and the back. But I would also say regular deadlifts as well. And I might throw in, I don't know what a Nordic leg curl is, but I'm thinking a Hungarian curl is when you're on your knees and then someone is either holding your ankles or you go to a machine where it's like holding your ankles down and you try and stay as straight up as possible.
That's a Nordic curl.
That is?
Yeah.
Okay. I've
never heard of a Hungarian curl.
Yeah, that's what I've always
got the wrong ethnicity going there.
Yeah. I mean, I would say for overall, I would definitely do deadlifts or RDLs. And
yeah, I would lean more toward the RDL just simply because there's a little less risk on the back. Again, when done properly, deadlifts, unless you're doing more of a hex bar deadlift, can have some risks of injuries that are a little more unnecessary. And so I'm a little less inclined to do straight deadlifts unless you're going into powerlifting, especially for athletes. And for older adults, again, you want to learn to lift with your legs, not your back. And most people are not going to be picking anything up from a true barbell deadlift position. They're more likely to be picking things up from more of a hex bar kind of deadlift position, or I would even argue going to a Zercher squat from that regard. So far, we're not disagreeing with their choices of exercises. We might be a little bit different in terms of what we would do instead.
We're not disagreeing. We're just saying they're obsolete.
No, I don't think they're obsolete. I don't necessarily agree with some of the options that they are giving for the exercises. And I think there's always more options when you really look at things, and you can't just go by one or two exercises. So their next one is the lateral raise. And why it sucks is if performed incorrectly, lateral raises can lead to shoulder impingement and unnecessary stress on the rotator cuff. This is often due to lifting too heavy, which encourages the use of momentum rather than muscle engagement, or lifting the arms above parallel to the ground, which puts the shoulders in a vulnerable position. Now, that to me is not the fault of the exercise. That's the fault of the exercise being incorrectly performed. And I don't have any fault with the lateral raise if done correctly. And when they talk about, using momentum rather than muscle engagement, that's one of the things I very rarely program lateral raise with the wrestlers, but when I do, or I have some that choose to come in and do them anyhow, they all go too heavy. They're doing much more of a shrug than a lateral raise, or using too much trapezius. They go way too heavy and they're not getting any benefit out of it. If you go light, you go through the right range of motion, you're not going too high above parallel to where you're getting into that impingement area. I don't think the lateral raise is such a bad exercise. It just needs to be performed correctly.
I guess I'm having a hard time because the picture that they have for the lateral raise, I guess I'm having a hard time because I'm thinking shoulder fly where you're primarily focused on the deltoids.
That's the lateral raise.
All right. Yeah. I would say overall obsolete.
Obsolete.
Yeah, I would say if you really want to develop your delts to either do a military press or something overhead, that's going to hit.
I think the overhead press has a much greater risk of impingement than a lateral raise.
No.
Oh, I mean, trust me, I have shoulder issues and I get more pain and difficulty from doing a military press. And the military press is often performed behind the neck, which puts you in an even more externally rotated position and in a much more vulnerable position than pressing in front. So I don't have any problem necessarily with overhead presses. I think we just want to kind of be careful with those, watch the range of motion. But you're generally going to be already in a much more abducted position. You're taking the shoulder above the horizontal position. So it really becomes a different exercise. You do tend to focus on the anterior head a little bit more than the lateral heads, or the medial head rather, of the deltoid. So again, we're talking different exercises. The lateral raise is a bit more of an isolation exercise, so you're not going to get tricep work out of it. So I get that part of it, but looking at going to a military press, overhead press, as opposed to a lateral raise, you're really just talking a very different exercise. I think if I were going to adjust the lateral raise, I would go with a recommendation of doing a lateral raise where you're leaning your body toward the weight so that when the weight is hanging down, with gravity, you are in a position where you've already got some tension on the deltoid and you're able to raise out to the side more effectively. And I think that puts a little bit better tension on it. They recommend using a cable pull. They recommend cable face pulls. Again, a different exercise. I would recommend that more for the traps and a little bit more for the posterior delt. But for lateral delts, it's really hard to get any good lateral delt development without doing more of a lateral raise.
Ironically, I just read an article on the little shoulder flies or these lateral raises, and they actually recommended leaning away from the weight. So if you have the weight here in your right hand, you would take your left hand and you'd lean against the wall. And the reason for that is as you're coming up or down, you're adding a little bit more resistance the whole way versus leaning into it. You got the resistance coming up because of gravity, but as it comes down, there's less resistance on the negative. Again, just one article. That was an actual literature. They also talked about if you want to hit that posterior delt, a simple trick instead of just it's going to be how you grip the dumbbell and then prioritize on having that pinky come up. If you focus on having the pinky come up, that hits that posterior delt.
But again, the lateral raise is to emphasize the medial head of the deltoid. Posterior delt, if you're doing any form of a row, you're going to be getting the posterior delts pretty effectively. If you're doing any form of a horizontal press or even an overhead press, you're getting the anterior delt a lot more.
I'm just going off.
Yeah, the argument would be, do you really need to focus so much on the lateral delt for aging well? And I would say from the aging well standpoint, it's not as necessary, but it's kind of good once in a while to kind of work some of those other smaller muscle groups in an accessory fashion. And I think doing some lateral raises is not going to be a bad thing as long as it's done correctly. And we're an audio only podcast. And so some of these visuals we might be talking about are going to be a little less clear. So I would encourage the listener, if they want to do some lateral raises, go look at some, reputable YouTube videos that can give you some good instruction. Look at some of the varieties and hopefully it meshes with what we're trying to convey here over this episode. So let's go on to number 8. And this one I
it's your favorite.
Wholeheartedly agree with. Any heavyweight exercise done standing on a Bosu ball. And I had a student a while back who was so insistent on doing so much of everything on the Bosu ball and was so insistent that it builds strength. And it absolutely does not build strength. You cannot build strength on an unstable surface because that instability is going to cause you to lift less weight. You're going to be focusing in on the smaller muscles surrounding the joint that are stabilizing that joint. Not that that is necessarily a bad thing, but this should be done more in a prehabilitation kind of setting. They say why it sucks is performing heavyweight exercises on an unstable surface like a Bosu ball can compromise form and increase the risk of injury. I agree with that. I don't know it's necessarily going to compromise form per se, or that it inherently increases the risk of injury. The biggest fault I have with trying to do heavyweight exercises standing on a Bosu ball is that you're not going to effectively be able to transfer force from the ground into the direction you're moving. And so just simply do the normal exercise on the ground in good control with heavy resistance and good form, and maybe shift to some unilateral exercises a little bit more to get a little bit more of that instability to get some of the smaller muscles. But if you want to work on those small little muscles and do stuff standing on a Bosu ball and all that, that's fine. But just realize it's going to be less effective use of your time in the gym. And if you're trying to train as effectively as possible, do the stuff that's going to be much more effective. Any comments?
I think with Bosu balls, I think you just need to determine what your goals are. If you are trying to add muscles, then yes, Dr. Armstrong is correct. You got to add more weight in order to have more resistance to gain muscle mass. But if you want to just focus on balance and stability training, then I mean, that could be, but there's other options.
But again, we go back to Carmine's law, strength plus posture equals balance. And so building strength, building on that postural positioning is going to have a far better impact on balance than standing on a damn Bosu ball.
Yeah, I don't really have much to say about Bosu balls. I'm
not a fan. I mean, you can do some fun YouTube kind of stuff on there, but it's not going to be on my top list. And I do not have a Bosu ball downstairs in my gym. So let's move on to number 9, the weighted side bend. Of course, that sucks. It's the stupidest exercise you can do in the gym. And why is it stupid?
Because no one, that's not a natural movement.
Well, it's not I think it's a natural movement to, laterally bend, we
like
move
that
from side to side. Well,
where you keep your legs
down to the side.
Yeah, but I'm also bending my legs too.
No, you're not bending your legs. Well, I don't understand what you're saying about bending your legs.
I'm not going to stand up and then pick something up and completely tilt my side looking like a question mark in order to pick something up.
Well,
I'm either going to bend forward.
Might be incorporated with other movements, but we do laterally bend. I mean, it's a typical functional movement that, we talk about in kinesiology and things like that. And the muscles, one of the functions of the oblique muscles is to laterally bend. And so theoretically, bending to the side and pulling on a dumbbell is going to have an effect on the oblique muscles. But the reality is that you're not really moving against gravity, because all you're doing is you're bending your body, and it's not really what's lifting the weight. And so their argument I don't totally agree with. It's like, however, this exercise can inadvertently contribute to widening the waistline by thickening the oblique muscles. Well, thickening comes from hypertrophy. So we want to hypertrophy the muscles to be stronger. So you can't get stronger without some level of thickening, unless you're going for that aesthetic look and we're not really worried about strength. But from a performance standpoint, a thicker waist from muscle rather than fat is going to be more functional, more effective. And it says it can put unnecessary strain on the spine when performed with heavy weights. Well, yes and no. I would say my argument would be that you could keep adding more and more weight on there and you're not really doing anything significant. And so there are far better ways to hit those oblique muscles. Again, my favorite way to probably do that would be some heavy Zercher squats and other movements like Bulgarian bag, doing some of those types of exercises. But they recommend planks and their variations. I think planks are great, but eventually you kind of get to the point where the plank isn't going to give you progressive overload like you would get with doing some other exercises. But really, just any of the more effective core exercises are going to give you a better effect than the weighted side bend. Doing farmer carries, the weighted carries is, again, even a better exercise for strengthening those muscles than doing a weighted side bend. So poo-pooing on that one. I agree with them that that's one of the exercises that sucks, but maybe disagreeing a little bit on the whys and maybe some of the alternatives. Now, number 10, I think, can be a bit of an overstatement. They say anything on the Smith machine. What do you think?
If you would have asked younger me, I would have been like, oh yeah, Smith machine suck. Actually, no, the older I get and the more you realize like you might not always have a workout buddy to spot you. And so the Smith machine can actually be kind of a built-in spotter. I don't know. I think my opinion on Smith machine has definitely changed. I think it just kind of depends on what your goals are. Are free weights better? And am I always going to promote free weights over machines? Yeah, 100%. But I think it just kind of depends on what exercises you're doing and what your overall goal is and how you're actually utilizing the Smith machine.
I would probably disagree with using a Smith machine as a spotter. First of all, it's not going to be a spotter for you because if you're going heavy and you do kind of get in a stuck position, oftentimes getting that racked and being able to kind of rotate the bar to get it back into its clips to hold it is going to be really, really tough. And so it should not be used as a spotter. I would prefer, if I'm doing squats, to have a safety bar in position that if I fail, I can drop down to that. I'm not going to drop too low. It's a little bit lower than my training depth, but it can catch the weight and prevent me from getting injured. The Smith machine, the faults that I have with the Smith machine is primarily that it is along a fixed path. And most of us do not move through ranges of motion in a linear pathway. There are exercises that can be done on a Smith machine, so I would definitely not argue that no exercise should be done on a Smith machine. I use the Smith machine for calf raises because in a calf raise, I pretty much go with a linear path. My body can kind of move a little bit underneath the weight, but it is the best way for me, not having any kind of calf raise machine, to do calves effectively. Will I squat on it? No. Do I do shrugs on it? No. Would I do a military press on it? No. Because again, with a fixed path, I prefer for the joint to be able to move through its normal kind of multi-axial patterns. But I would not say with an absolute that anything on the Smith machine sucks. Because there are exercises that can be done on there depending on your goals and what you're trying to do. I mean, I see a lot of people who do variations of the squat on there and they can do them effectively, more of like a hack squat type of movement. So I would not discount the Smith machine, but like you said, I think it depends on what your goals are, what you're trying to accomplish in that situation. This next one's an interesting one. Number 11 is hyperextension. Why it sucks? While aimed at strengthening the lower back, hyperextensions can often lead to overextension and strain on the lumbar spine when performed excessively or with improper form. Well, let's face it, anything done in improper form can exacerbate the lower back and cause issues. So what do you think?
Are they talking about, because they don't even have a photo with this one.
No.
Are they talking about like when you're laying on the ground and you're lifting your arms and your legs, those little Superman things? I can't even picture what it is.
I mean, I think it's a bit of an overstatement here. I would argue there are certain hyperextension, because hyperextension just means you're simply going beyond anatomical position. And so to really optimally strengthen the lower back muscles, you need to go into a slight hyperextension
Right.
in certain cases. Now, doing heavily weighted, doing them in poor form is going to be, less than optimal and increase the risk of injury. They recommend instead doing bird dogs, which is a bit more of an isometric. It doesn't get you in a full hyperextension. The nice thing with them is that you are working both sides of the vertebral column independently, which can have some benefit. But I would not say completely dismiss hyperextensions. I'm not a fan of good mornings, but good mornings aren't really a hyperextension, and that's not why I don't like the good mornings. I don't not like the glute ham machine and kind of going into a hyperextension in that point. But, if you're doing them properly with the proper amount of weight, I think it's important to do hyperextensions because those are muscles that are very important to our core strength and to posture and overall functioning. So on this one, I think I'm going to disagree with them on all accounts. I don't like the hyperextension, and I don't necessarily agree that the exercises that they recommend are necessarily the best exercises.
Number 12, Yate rows. It looks like the photo that they have is someone doing a bent over row with a reverse grip. The Yate row performs with an underhand grip, can place excessive stress on the bicep tendons and the wrist. This variation of the row also tends to encourage a more upright torso, which can reduce engagement of the targeted upper back muscles and increase lower back strain.
I wholeheartedly disagree. The Yates row is done for a specific purpose. It is basically a more vertical bent over row. It is not intended to engage the lower lats. It's much more upper back and rhomboids. You get some bicep work out of it. I do agree that it can increase the risk of lower back strain if done improperly. But same thing with a bent over row. So if you're going to poo-poo the Yates row, you got to poo-poo the bent over row or any other form of rowing exercise. They say to do instead the traditional overhand bent row. It offers a safer grip position. I don't understand how that's a safer grip and posture. The posture is just a little bit different, but you're still, in both cases, engaging the hamstrings and the glutes in order to execute a proper hip hinge to get you in that position and to hold yourself there. You're stabilizing the core in order to maintain that position. So I think as long as you're doing those things, any bent over row, whether it's a Yates row, a standard bent over row, underhand grip, overhand grip, dumbbell, Meadows row, we can go on a whole list of different rowing movements. It's really a matter of what muscles are we trying to target. They're going to target the muscles a little bit differently. I don't necessarily agree with the overhand grip. I think the underhand grip puts the arms in a much better position. You're more likely to be pulling into the lower waist rather than really forcing more of a shoulder exercise. You're going to be working more with the lats. I don't agree with this one at all. I like the Yates row. I don't program it a lot simply because it is more upper back, and I think I can get some of the same effects out of doing a more standard bent over row. Doing RDLs, you get some of that same kind of muscle engagement. So what are your thoughts?
Well, when I hear Yates, I think Dorian Yates.
I think that's where it comes from.
Where it's. Yeah. And, that guy won the Olympia a few times. So if it worked for him, why not? And honestly, I think if you just prioritize form, you're not going to have the strain on the lower back that they talk about.
Yeah, I had an athlete the other day that didn't come to weightlifting because he said he'd strained his back deadlifting, and forget what excuse he had, but I said, it's from doing improper form. It's not from doing the deadlift. You get hurt lifting any exercise, it's improper form. It's not the exercise itself. Very few of these exercises are inherently evil. They're just maybe a little bit more difficult to do. There might be a little bit more risk of doing them improperly, and maybe that's a reason not to do them. But you don't get hurt doing an exercise properly. If you have the proper weight, proper body positioning, proper stabilization, you're not going to get hurt. And I don't think the Yates row is such a bad exercise. All right, number 13, the partial squat. What do you think? Why does it suck? Because partial squats are where the descent is limited and doesn't reach the depth where thighs are parallel to the ground, can lead to imbalanced muscle development and place undue stress on the knees. What do you think?
Half squat, half rep Henry. You don't want to limit yourself. If you're going to the gym to work out, you want to make sure that you're getting the most out of your workout. You don't want to cheat yourself. With that also being said, some people that are beginners or new or novice in their workout journey, they may be limited to a full range of motion where they don't actually, for whatever limitation they have, they may not be able to get it. But if they can slowly increase that range of motion, I think over time it's going to be beneficial for anyone, not just for a bodybuilder or someone hitting their fitness goals, but for overall aging well health. Trying to get that full range of motion in is going to be really beneficial.
Well, I think there's a lot to parcel out here. First of all, the full range of motion squat. And again, the range of motion is going to be a bit more individualized depending on your hip mechanics and your mobility and those types of things. And if you don't have a full range of motion squat, then you need to work on the mobility issues. Go light enough to be able to do a full range of motion squat in your exercise. So you're going that full range of motion without changing the form and everything. I don't think it's bad to do really deep squats. I'm not a Joel Seedman out there that thinks you should only go to 90 degrees. But I also don't think that there is harm in doing partial squats from time to time. There are reasons to do partial squats. It shouldn't be your only squat, but in certain situations where, say in a sports performance, like a basketball player never really is down into a really full deep squat position, and building a little bit more strength in the upper range of motion may actually be a little bit more beneficial to them. So whatever we do, we want to make sure that we are doing it in proper form. And I don't think that partial squats in proper form are going to be detrimental. They kind of talk about imbalanced muscle development. I don't know if I'd call it imbalanced muscle development. I don't think it puts undue stress on the knees. It can potentially put undue stress on the back, depending on how you're doing the squat. If you're doing it incorrectly, a lot of times people are doing a partial squat with much too much weight and not in a proper form, and that leads to injury. But partial squats can have a place. It, again, is going to depend on your goal. And if we're trying to get the most bang for our buck, obviously going through a full range of motion is going to be much, much more effective than doing a partial movement. And you get more overall muscle development. And from a bodybuilding standpoint, a fuller range of motion, getting more stretch on that muscle is going to cause more hypertrophy. Number 14, behind the neck pull down. And they have another quote from a PT, Jessica Malpelli. The behind the neck lat pull places a lot of stress on the anterior joint capsule of the shoulder and can eventually lead to impingement or even rotator cuff tears.
I think the literature out there actually goes back and forth with this particular exercise. I think there's a lot of literature that says don't do it behind the back because it can increase injury. And then there's also other literature that says, well, no, that's not entirely true. And there are a lot of benefits from doing it this way. I think any form of lat pull down, I personally like lat pull downs in the front where I'm bringing it down to my collarbone. To me, I don't have the range of motion to do it behind my back, but I have a buddy who does have the range of motion and he has amazing form and he sees a lot of benefits and a lot of gains out of this. So I think it just being aware of your limitations and seeing what actually works well for your biomechanics. I don't see anything wrong with an actual lat pull down. And the literature that is out there, there's things that talk about the benefits of front. There's also a lot that talk about the benefits of behind the back. So what are your thoughts on this one?
I mean, I'd prefer it in front. I'm not a huge fan of lat pull down overall anyhow. I'd rather see people doing pull-ups and chin-ups rather than pull downs, just simply because you get a little bit more muscle activation. But again, they're talking in regards to bodybuilding, and you need to kind of go through different ranges of motions, different positioning in order to get the most optimal development. But I would leave it at, if it causes your shoulders harm, if you have issues where excessive external rotation is going to be bad for your shoulder, then don't do it. If you have adequate range of motion, you have the right shoulder mechanics and anatomy, then it's not necessarily going to be a bad variation, but don't make it your only variation. And then similarly, number 15 is the behind the neck press. And they basically say it sucks for essentially the same reasons. It's in a harmful position, increase in the risk of impingement and injury. This can strain the neck and shoulders, especially under heavy loads. I agree with that to an extent, but I wouldn't totally dismiss behind the neck press. If I'm an Olympic lifter, you're going to need to be able to press from that position a bit more effectively. And so it may not cause you harm. I personally try to limit overhead pressing of any kind as much as possible, unless the person has pretty healthy shoulders, or do it to a minimal amount in order to preserve the health of the shoulders. There's many other things that we can do, an Arnold press and things like that, that can develop the shoulders without putting us in a position of impingement. But that being said, I don't think it's a horrible exercise. It would not be on my priority list for the shoulders. What's your thought?
I mean, the only thing I know I said military press earlier for the lateral delts in order to build the deltoids up. But when I said military press, I was thinking the military press was right in front, like sitting right on your collarbone, but having a more wider grip. As far as behind the back or behind the neck press goes, I just see it being more at risk of injury as you become more fatigued and you're trying to really thrust that weight up into the air. You run the risk of conking yourself on the back of your head and hitting that occipital bone, and just
that's not a fault of the exercise. That's the fault of the exercise they're doing properly.
There's no denying fatigue does set in, and
I mean, you do a front press, you can catch your chin going up, you can catch your forehead, your nose coming down. I mean, so it's the same rationale there. So with any of the presses, I think really the biggest issue is going to be range of motion. I think it's much better to come down to about mouth or chin level, not all the way down to the neck or the chest. And that's going to affect some of that potential risk of impingement. So I don't think it's a bad exercise. I would prefer that people do more of an overhead press to the front as opposed to the rear. The final exercise is ab machines. And they say why it sucks. Many ab machines lock you into a fixed path of movement that can place unnatural stress on your lower back and hip flexors, potentially leading to discomfort and injury. I don't wholeheartedly agree with that. I think most of them, it's not any different of a movement pattern than doing a standard crunch. So if you're going to say don't do a ab machine, then I would say don't do many of your standard ab exercises like, crunches and even bicycles and some of those things. And they recommend bicycle crunches and hanging leg raises as things to do instead. I think there's far better ways to work your core. But, if you're trying to go for that rectus abdominis development, I tend to favor that machine, particularly like the old Nautilus ones or the hammer strength ab machines, kind of like what's pictured in the article, over doing like a cable crunch and some of those types of exercises. So what are your thoughts?
I agree with the fact that there's several different other ways to work the core, whether you're doing an isometric with a plank or standing with a farmer carry, any twisting motion. So whether you're taking a weight off the ground and twisting it up above your head in the air, whether you're doing leg lifts, whether you're doing crunches or Russian twists or whatever the case may be, there's a lot of different ways to actually utilize your core muscles. And in fact, it's in my opinion that any workout that we do, we're engaging the core, especially deadlifts, squats. We're constantly using that. But there's no denying that the more weight we add, the more resistance we have, the more we put that strain on the muscles to have it grow. So if you are wanting your rectus abdominis to really pop out and show off that six pack, this could be a really good machine that adds the hypertrophy factor to the front portion of your abs.
Yeah, so kind of to wrap this all up for time, I think the 16 exercises that they dismiss are probably ones that I would not prioritize. Some of them, like the lateral raise, I think are somewhat important to incorporate in some training, but not as a primary exercise. As we kind of run through these, kind of going back through, number one was the pec fly. I think there's far better alternatives to doing that, but from a bodybuilding standpoint, it's not a bad exercise, although, again, probably doing other exercises would be more effective. Concentration curl, not a priority. Tricep kickbacks, not enough benefit out of it and better alternatives. Rolling shrugs, stupid exercise. Leg extension, leg curls, good for isolation and for bodybuilding development, but from a overall functional standpoint and performance standpoint, probably not the best exercises. Lateral raises, I personally think that's not a bad exercise to incorporate. Anything done on a Bosu ball, absolutely do not do those. That's a waste of time. Weighted side bend exercises, again, huge waste of time. Anything on a Smith machine, we got to be a little bit more selective in what we're talking about. There are things that can be effectively done on a Smith machine. Hyperextension, I think, is a necessary exercise to incorporate when we're trying to isolate those lower back muscles, maybe for rehabilitation and some of those purposes. You got to hyperextend. You just got to do it properly, although many other exercises are going to be incorporating those muscles effectively. The Yates row, I don't think is a bad exercise for working certain muscles in the posterior chain. Is it as effective as a bent over row or other versions? Maybe not, but it's not hitting the same muscles. It's not intended to do the same. Partial squats, if done for a proper purpose, but ideally let's do a full range of motion squat. Behind the neck pull down, only, don't do it if it gives you any kind of shoulder issues or injuries. Same with a behind and neck press, ab machines. There's better ways to work the core. So overall, I'd say the 16 exercises, they do pretty good in terms of identifying what should not be done, providing some alternatives, although I don't think we've agreed entirely with all the alternatives. Any last things to add as we wrap up today's episode?
I think in the end, no matter what your exercise journey is, if you're going for some of the clickbait stuff, see if there's a better alternative that might be out there. Utilizing the alternatives to match your goals or your body mechanics can always help you age well.
Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast. And until next time, keep aging well.